For thousands of years, one ring of stones has stood alone on a windswept plain in southern England, and for most of that time, nobody could agree on the simplest questions about it. Who built it? Where the stones came from? How they got there? What it was actually for? But over the last few years, scientists armed with laser scanners, satellite mapping tools, and computer systems built to sort through mountains of data have quietly been answering questions that stumped historians for centuries. And what they found isn't just interesting. Some of it completely overturns what we thought we knew. Stay with me to the end, because the final discovery on this list might be the strangest one of all. And if you like this kind of story, subscribe now before we get into it. Now let's start with the basics, because you need to understand what Stonehenge actually is before the new discoveries make any sense. Stonehenge sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, and construction there began roughly 5,000 years ago, somewhere around 3000 BC, but it wasn't built all at once. It was built, changed, rebuilt, and rearranged over a span of more than 1,500 years, in at least 3 or 4 major construction phases. The monument people picture in photographs, the massive standing stones topped with horizontal lintels forming a circle, came later in that timeline, sometime around 2500 BC. Before that, the site started out as something much simpler, a circular ditch and bank, with a ring of wooden posts and small bluestones, the kind of monument archaeologists call a henge. Over time, the wooden elements disappeared and the stone elements grew larger, heavier, and more deliberate. By the time it reached the form we recognize today, Stonehenge included 2 very different types of rock. The enormous outer stones, some standing over 4 meters tall and weighing more than 20 tons, are called sarsens, a hard sandstone. Inside that outer ring sits a second set of much smaller stones known as bluestones, along with one unusual centerpiece called the altar stone. For over a century, that basic layout was about all anyone could confidently say. Everything else was guesswork. The first real breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic dig. It came from lasers. In 2011, English Heritage commissioned one of the most detailed digital surveys ever attempted on the monument. Teams used laser scanners to capture the surface of every single stone, recording geometry down to fractions of a millimeter across the entire site. The goal at the time was mostly conservation, to build a precise digital record of the stones as they existed, so any future erosion or damage could be measured and tracked. But once researchers had that much raw data sitting in front of them, something unexpected happened. When specialists started combing through the scans using pattern recognition software designed to pick out subtle changes in surface texture, they began finding things that were invisible to the naked eye. Faint carvings worn almost completely flat by thousands of years of wind, rain, and lichen growth. In total, the survey revealed more than 100 previously unknown carvings cut into the stones, most of them Bronze Age axe heads, along with a smaller number of dagger shapes. Some of these carvings had actually been spotted decades earlier by a curious archaeologist using a raking light in the 1950s, but nobody had ever mapped them systematically, or understood how many there truly were. The laser data changed that instantly. Suddenly, researchers weren't looking at a handful of scratches. They were looking at a wall of Bronze Age artwork that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, just too faint for human eyes to register. That discovery raised an obvious question. Why would anyone carve dozens of axes into these particular stones? The leading theory ties back to what axes actually meant in Bronze Age Britain. A bronze axe wasn't just a tool, it was a status object, something linked to wealth, trade, and often to funerary ritual. Similar axes. Carvings have turned up on burial monuments elsewhere in Britain and across parts of continental Europe from the same period. If that connection holds, the carvings suggest that centuries after Stonehenge was originally built, later generations were still returning to the site and treating it as sacred enough to leave their own religious or memorial markings on stones that were already by their time ancient history. In other words, Stonehenge wasn't just built once and left alone. People kept coming back to it, adding their own meaning to it for well over 1,000 years after the last major stone was raised. The next major shift came from a completely different direction, geochemistry, but paired with exactly the kind of detailed digital mapping and computational matching that lets researchers compare mineral signatures against thousands of possible source locations almost automatically. In 2020, a research team led by geomorphologist David Nash set out to answer a question that had bothered archaeologists for a century. Where did the giant sarsen stones actually come from? Everyone assumed they came from somewhere reasonably close, since moving 20-ton boulders any real distance without wheels or draft animals sounds almost impossible. But nobody had proven exactly where. Nash's team used portable X-ray fluorescence scanners directly on the stones to measure their chemical composition, then compared that chemical fingerprint against sarsen boulders from dozens of locations across southern England. Most of the samples matched a chemical profile pointing to a single area. Westwoods, near Marlborough, roughly 25 kilometers north of Stonehenge. That distance might not sound dramatic compared to what came next, but moving stones that size even 25 kilometers across Neolithic terrain without the wheel was already an engineering puzzle that historians are still trying to fully explain. And then, in 2024, came the discovery that genuinely shocked even veteran Stonehenge researchers. It centers on the altar stone, the flat, recumbent slab of sandstone lying at the very heart of the monument, partly buried beneath two collapsed sarsens. For decades, the standard assumption was that the altar stone came from roughly the same region as the bluestones, an area in the Preseli Hills of West Wales, an already impressive distance of around 250 kilometers. A team led by geologist Anthony Clark at Curtin University decided to test that assumption directly. Since researchers weren't permitted to chip fresh samples from the stone itself, they instead analyzed tiny mineral grains, zircon, apatite, and rutile, preserved in fragments collected from earlier excavations, some of which had been sitting in storage since the 1840s. By measuring the age and chemical signature of those mineral grains, the team could essentially trace the rock back to the specific geological formation it originally came from, the same basic logic used to trace a fingerprint back to one specific person. When the results came back, they ruled out Wales entirely. The chemical signature was an almost perfect match for a region called the Orcadian Basin in the far northeast of Scotland, an area that stretches up toward Orkney. The distance from that region to Stonehenge is more than 750 kilometers. That number is worth sitting with for a second. 750 kilometers in a period with no wheeled carts, no domesticated horses strong enough for the job, and no known road. Network. Moving a stone weighing around 6 tons that far is almost harder to explain than the pyramids. Researchers still aren't sure exactly how it happened. The leading theory is that the stone was moved by sea, likely along the coastline in some kind of large timber boat or raft, since dragging it overland across the geography between Orkney and Wiltshire would have meant crossing rivers, hills, and dense forest for the entire route. If the sea route theory is correct, it means Neolithic Britain had a level of maritime capability nobody had given it credit for. What makes this even stranger is what it implies about the people who built Stonehenge in the first place. If builders were willing to transport one single stone from the opposite end of the island, that wasn't a matter of convenience. It was a deliberate choice, meaning that specific piece of rock, and wherever it came from, mattered enough to justify one of the most difficult transportation efforts in the entire history of prehistoric Britain. Researchers at University College London have since argued that this discovery supports a bigger theory about what Stonehenge might have actually been for. Rather than being a purely local monument, it may have functioned as something closer to a unifying symbol, a physical structure built specifically from materials gathered across the length of Britain, almost as a way of tying together different farming communities that were otherwise spread across a huge and disconnected landscape. Under that theory, Stonehenge wasn't just an astronomical calendar or a burial site. It may have been something closer to a political statement carved in stone, a monument built to say, in effect, that people from Scotland, Wales, and southern England were all part of one shared world. The bluestones themselves have their own story, and it's just as strange. Unlike the sarsens or the altar stone, the bluestones were traced years earlier to a specific set of quarries in the Preseli Hills of Wales, particularly two sites known as Craig Rosy Felin and Carn Godog. What made this identification so precise wasn't guesswork either. Researchers led by archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson found actual quarrying tools, stone wedges and hammerstones, left behind at these Welsh sites, along with clear extraction scars in the rock face that matched the exact mineral composition of stones sitting at Stonehenge today. That match was detailed enough that researchers could tie specific bluestones at the monument back to specific extraction points on a specific rock face nearly 250 kilometers away. Even stranger, radiocarbon dating at these Welsh quarry sites suggested some of the stones may have been extracted centuries before Stonehenge as we know it was even built, which raises the possibility that these bluestones originally stood somewhere else first, possibly as an earlier stone circle in Wales, before being dismantled, transported, and reassembled on Salisbury Plain. If that theory holds, Stonehenge wouldn't just be a monument built from imported material. It would be, at least partly, a monument built by transplanting an older monument wholesale and rebuilding it 200 kilometers from where it started. Put all of that together, and the picture of Stonehenge that emerges from modern data looks nothing like the picture historians had a generation ago. This is no longer a monument built from whatever heavy stones happened to be lying around nearby. It's a structure deliberately assembled from materials gathered across almost the entire length of the island. Sarsens from a specific wood, 25 kilometers north, an altar stone hauled from the northern tip of Scotland, and bluestones carried simply didn't exist a generation ago, laser scans precise enough to reveal carvings worn down to nearly nothing, and mineral fingerprinting precise enough to trace a single rock back to one specific valley on the far side of the country. There's still one more layer to this story, and it's the part that keeps researchers up at night the most, the actual construction. Digital modeling of the stones combined with experimental. Archaeology projects that have tried recreating Neolithic transportation methods using timber sledges, ropes, and teams of volunteers suggests that moving even the closer sarsen stones from West Woods would have required immense coordinated labor, likely hundreds of people working together over an extended period. Scale that up to the logistics of moving a 6-ton slab from Scotland by sea, then hauling it inland to its final position, and you start to understand why some researchers now describe Stonehenge less as a single construction project and more as a multi-generational undertaking, one that might have taken different communities working across decades or possibly longer to complete. So where does that leave the biggest question of all? What was Stonehenge actually built for? Even with everything modern science has uncovered, the honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, and the new data hasn't settled the debate so much as it's added new angles to it. The old theories are all still on the table. Some researchers still favor the astronomical explanation, pointing to the monument's famous alignment with the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset, arguing it functioned as a kind of calendar, marking the turning points of the year for a farming society that depended on tracking seasons precisely. Others lean toward the funerary theory, since cremated human remains dating back to the earliest phase of construction have been found buried around the site, suggesting Stonehenge may have started life as a burial ground for a specific and possibly elite group of people. And now, with the altar stone traced all the way to Scotland, a newer theory has gained real traction. The idea that Stonehenge functioned as a kind of unity monument, a shared project meant to physically connect distant and otherwise disconnected communities scattered across Neolithic Britain. It's entirely possible that all three explanations are partly true at once. Monuments built over 1,500 years rarely serve just one single purpose the entire time. A structure that started as a burial ground for a local community could easily have evolved into a solstice calendar and later still into a symbolic gathering point that stitched together farming groups from Scotland to Wales to southern England, each generation adding new meaning on top of what earlier generations had already built. What's genuinely remarkable is how much of this we only learned in just the last 5 to 15 years, and almost none of it came from digging new holes in the ground. It came from scanning what was already sitting right there in plain sight, stones that had been staring back at millions of visitors for centuries, and finally having the tools precise enough to actually read them properly. The carvings were always on the surface, just worn down past the point human eyes could register them. The altar stone's origin was always locked inside its mineral grains, just waiting for chemistry precise enough to unlock it. In some ways, that might be the most humbling part of this entire story. Stonehenge didn't need new secrets hidden somewhere underground to still hold discoveries. It just needed better tools to reveal what had been sitting in front of everyone the entire time. And that raises an uncomfortable question for anyone who's ever assumed we already understand our own history. If a monument this famous, this heavily studied, sitting in an open field and photographed by millions of tourists every single year, could still be hiding secrets, like a 750-kilometer journey from Scotland, what else is sitting in plain sight at other ancient sites around the world, simply waiting for someone to point the right instrument at it? Stonehenge has been examined by archaeologists for well over 300 years, and somehow some of its biggest secrets were only cracked in the last few years. Not because anyone dug deeper, but because someone finally looked closer. If this pulled you into something you never expected to care about, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe if you want more of these hidden histories, because there are plenty more waiting to be uncovered. Drop a comment and tell me honestly. Do you think Stonehenge was built as a calendar, a burial ground, or a monument meant to unite ancient Britain? I genuinely want to hear which theory you land on. On the next episode, we're heading to a 9,000-year-old site in Turkey that archaeologists have just reopened. And what they found carved into the stone there has left experts struggling to come up with an explanation. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.